This week, I thought we'd dip our toes once again into the distribution works of SOV Horror, a one-man army leading the charge into the preservation of key SOV history that could quite often be overlooked by bigger studios due to a lot of these titles quite often being the first foray into filmmaking by the creators, or due to the films themselves being a little bit rough around the edges. Last time, we took a look at two films by SOV filmmaking legend Joe Sherlock. But today, we're going to be checking out two movies from another pillar of the community, Chris Seaver. Seaver, for those who may not be aware, has himself worked in the distribution game with Warlock Home Video, producing, directing, writing and distributing almost 90 titles across a 30-plus year run. Shorts, features, music videos, they've been there, done it and bought the t-shirt. And they're actually on YouTube continuing to make content to this day over at It Crept from the 80s. Do be sure to head over there and give them some love. Seaver's biggest hits to date are likely his work on the Filthy McNasty films, Mulver, and his long-standing intertwining cinematic universe for what surely is bordering on mascot status for the company, Teen Ape. But today, we're going to be going right back to a couple of films that were made to help launch Warlock Home Video back in 2011. Starting with the first film the label distributed, 2011's DieBQ. It's a short film clocking in at just over 34 minutes long, but believe me when I say that this thing physically cannot cram any more into its runtime if it tried. Breakneck is a bit of an understatement. The film's largely shown from the perspective of a new age hippie normie, Moonbeam, and her recently rehabilitated boyfriend, Brody. Brody was in with a strange crowd of beer-swilling, meat-eating, hard-smoking, horny degenerates who basically just want to screw, pound brewskis and eat as much meat as their blood pressure will let them. Moonbeam's a teetotal vegan who's clean living and has been slowly bringing Brody around to her way of thinking. As the film opens, we see Moonbeam and Brody talking about an upcoming party weekender, and she's concerned that she's going to feel like a complete outcast because everyone else at the party is going to be the exact thing she's been working so hard to work out of Brody. She hates his old friends and thinks they're weirdos who are on a long, narrow road to achieving nothing in life. Brody reassures her that he won't eat meat or drink at the party and that he'll fully support her through the weekend to try and have the best time possible. Shortly after that, their ride turns up, driven by Lance, who's been drinking since the early hours of the morning and after shouting incoherently about getting some of that pussy, hops out of his car to take a piss on Moonbeam and Brody's apartment? House? It's not that clear. After a somewhat tepid greeting, Lance introduces the pair to Axe, a woman he met at a poker game last night who is invited to the barbecue with the intention of pounding her. She's just got out of prison with a long charge sheet, so the pair are keen to try and keep as far away from her as possible. After a fairly long drive, to pad the runtime, where the car shifts from driving on a road to gently being rocked to try and give the illusion of movement, they all arrive at the party organised by top gents Rick and DJ. Rick answers the door in a very fetching Dragon Sound t-shirt and appears to be both smashed and or high. Cue extended tour of the kitchen in which the basics of a kitchen are described in extended detail. I should probably point out at this point that, up until this point, we had only seen Rick and DJ in a limited capacity and that all of the other characters have been describing them as insane, feral goblin people who are known for leaving trails of carnage in their wake. The kitchen tour goes on for way too long. Anyway, the tour is interrupted when Ryan and Axe suggest playing a game of Suits, and while that's happening, Brody and Moonbeam head into the other room to have sex. This also goes on for way too long given the film's short runtime, but does feature a scene where Axe offers to get her tits out, she doesn't, and it features the line, "Major League Yabos." So, I guess that's a win? DJ interrupts Brody and Moonbeam post-sex and immediately suggests that they head outside, start a fire, and tell spooky stories to each other. Cueing the obligatory bit where they all tell scary stories around a campfire and then one of the gang in a monster mask jumps out and pretends to be the serial killer, but he's not, and then everyone's kinda miffed moment. Moonbeam decides that that's her and Brody's cue to hit the hay, so the pair head off for the night because they have a big day at the barbecue in the morning, while the rest of the gang drink heavily into the night. The next day, Ryan wakes everyone up and they're hanging. But the thought of succulent grilled meats gets them up and back on the beers. And what follows is a montage of goofing around and grilling meats. The party's in full swing. But Lance ends up causing a bit of an issue when he upsets Moonbeam because Moonbeam hates being stuck at a drunken mess around, and when Brody tries to defend Moonbeam, Lance calls him out too. So both Moonbeam and Brody storm off because the party was dumb anyway. While all this is going on, a feral rat pisses green all over the barbecue meats. No one notices, they grill up the food and pound back even more beers before eating the tainted meat. Brody and Moonbeam reconcile that maybe things got a bit heated, and after making out for a bit, they decide to head back to the party. But things are far from fine. The gang are all puking and shitting green water, and no one's keeping an eye on the grill. In a bodily fluid-fueled finale, will Moonbeam and Brody save the day? Will the rat get what's coming to it? And just who is the Warlock? All this and more will be answered if you check out DieBQ. And honestly, this one's probably going to be a Marmite film for anyone hitting play. You're either going to think this is a fun and at times charming but kind of flawed short, or you'll hate the absolute bones of the thing. I honestly can't see anyone coming out of this thing just shrugging and being like, yeah, that was a movie, I guess. For the record, I actually kind of liked it, but it most definitely is a flawed production in my opinion, and it really starts with the script. In the extra features of the DieBQ DVD, Chris mentions that the initial plan for the film was that he was going to have an entire cast made up of filmmakers exclusively, with the plan being to sketch a rough outline, but then let the filmmakers throw in ideas as the production rolled on so that it would become this giant melting pot of ideas and oddities. It didn't quite work out that way, sadly though, as some of the filmmakers did actively try to contribute, and some of them absolutely didn't. This ended up leading to Chris and the actor who played Rick, and regular collaborator with Chris, Andrew Baltus, to pretty much take over as main writers and directors for the feature. And it kinda shows. The script feels like something that was kind of hashed out over a long weekend, where the gang had this big idea of everyone having their say, but then about a day or so into production it was clear that that wasn't going to work, and they didn't have time to do reshoots, so they just put a couple of folk in charge of making the script have direction and a framework within which improvisation could be had if it could be manifested. That does, however, lead to a bit of a patchy end product, however. It's clear the film wasn't built to run for 30 plus minutes, so a lot of the scenes are drawn out well beyond the natural ending point. The act structuring's a bit lumpy, and the pacing within those acts are also a bit uneven. It results in some scenes feeling like you're having information shot directly into your eye sockets. And then 2 minutes later the brakes are hit hard as we get the kitchen tour, or the love scene, or just idle chatter where the gang head over to Rick and DJ's place. There's a strong manic energy in this thing over all 3 acts to try and cram as much plot in as possible into those 30 minutes, but it's clear a slim budget and not a lot of time with the full cast meant that corners did have to be cut in order to keep things rolling. Tonally, the film's a little all over the place as well. The marketing for the film would suggest a campy horror film. It's really more of a soft horror, strong comedy piece, truthfully. But the humour mainly consists of reading lines in an over-exaggerated snarky tone and gags about bodily functions. The titular DieBQ doesn't happen until about 10 minutes off the end of the movie, and the film ends right as the horror really begins. So if you're coming to this film expecting a bloodbath, well, there's a little bit of oozing, shitting and vomiting, but that's about it. It ends abruptly too, which really felt like a bit of a cockblock from the movie. Why introduce murderous, I drink your blood style rat piss infected maniacs if you aren't going to actually do anything with them? This is also a film that plays on the we know we're making a bad movie so we're going to lean into it style of filmmaking. The kind of film the likes of The Asylum have kind of made their calling card. In the extras, Chris says that he feels the biggest thing that lets this movie down is that they leant a little too hard into making the film intentionally bad. I would actually kind of disagree with him here though. I've seen films where the cast truly lean into bad filmmaking in a self-aware way, and it's basically unwatchable. This This does kind of do that, but I'd kind of place this one in a similar school to films like Nudist Colony of the Dead, where it is intentionally a bad movie and the cast are leaning into that to the point that it's painfully aware what they're doing, but at no point did I personally find myself gritting my teeth about the dialogue or the jokes or the inconsistent tonal choices. It gets close, don't get me wrong, it gets close, but it never fully tips into it for me. And as a result, I actually kinda quite liked it. It's imperfect as a written work, but the over-the-top enthusiastic deliveries from the cast did keep me watching. As mentioned, the film was written and directed by Chris Seaver and Andrew Baltus. We spoke about Chris at the top of the video, but Andrew's had a pretty solid run on the SOV front too. It's actually quite hard to gauge exactly how many films Andrew's worked in, as he uses a pseudonym sometimes, but according to IMDb he's got 17 acting credits and at least 2 writing and directing credits. But I reckon that's got to be quite a bit higher, and if you factor in times where he's helped as a consultant or script editor, it could be higher still. As a fun fact, one of his listed directing credits is for a 1995 film called The Curly Killer, which was a film that gets name-dropped in the campfire horror story scene in this film, which was a nice touch as a bit of an in-reference. As for the direction, it's not great. While this was the first Warlock Home video release, this wasn't Chris's first work, and the direction is strangely basic for most of the runtime. With it being a skeleton crew of everyone you see on screen plus Chris running the whole show, it's unsurprising that the film would have a bit of a basic construction, but then, at the same time, these are all filmmakers apparently. This should have looked gorgeous. You have half a dozen people who've made movies and probably know a bit about film theory in terms of composition and creative vision. So with that being said, I don't really understand why this thing has cast members idly sitting around chatting for most of the runtime, uninspiring washed out lighting setups, drab scene coordination and very little cinematic range beyond basic cuts and shot compositions. The cast direction's equally lifeless. If it wasn't for the bombastic line deliveries and improvised random dancing, it'd be in a much, much worse situation than it is. But as it stands, it's just a load of people sitting or standing in one location, going back and forth until one or two of the cast gently wander off camera. The Cine's not great too, barring the final 5-minute uncontrollable green liquid sequence, which, for low no budget SOV, is actually handled quite well. This is a bit of a washout, honestly. Poorly composed shots that are badly lit, lacking colour and overly compressed, cut together into sequences that use basic cuts and transitions. There's minimal B-roll to help bring the scenes to life. While I will give the film some credit in the sense that it does try to experiment in the third act a bit, around the time the horror kicks in, there's really nothing too great to say about how this thing looks. And the marketing does a hell of a job in selling this thing given what the end product looks like. Performance-wise, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some of the performers really get into the hamtastic nature of the film and fully embrace a loud, comedic and bombastic delivery. It's not perfect, but I found the biggest wins of the film came from the likes of DJ, Lance and Rick. The other half of the cast, by contrast, are way too mute. They actively work against the louder tone the other cast members are going for and end up coming across as overly quiet and uninteresting as a result. The actress who plays Axe is the only exception to this really. She plays her part largely quiet, but did get some of the bigger laughs for me, and her quiet but overly dry and withering put-downs were near perfectly timed. It's not high art, but they do what they can with it, and it's a bit of a minefield as a result. And finally, the soundtrack. It's made up mostly of copyrighted music tracks. Did they get the license for all of these? Hell no! Am I gonna knock on them to the cops? Hell no! It's oddly chosen and weirdly implemented. I wasn't a fan. I can find almost no information about DIBQ's initial release by Warlock. Whether it was online, on DVD or Blu-ray, I can't say. All I know is that it was shot and released in 2011 on some kind of format by Warlock Home Video. And then it vanished into the ether before being picked back up by SOV Horror, who seemingly made a deal to distribute at least 6 of Warlock's back catalogue across 2020 on DVD. And a fine enough job they've done of it. Given this was shot on videotape in 2011 and presented as a horror film from 1986, the original tape looks weathered, which is appropriate, but it's also overly compressed with pixelation plaguing portions of this film. which is a bit of a shame. However, the extras more than make up for it. There's a near full cast audio commentary for the film moderated by Seaver, an interview with Chris and Andrew, an archive interview with the cast on set, a full-length podcast from SOV Horror covering the film, and a superfans review of the movie, alongside trailers for other upcoming SOV Horror releases. It may not look perfect, but it's the best it's probably looked in a very long time, and the extras easily made this release worth the money I paid for it. Which makes it all the more of a shame that seemingly this title's out of print now, as it looks like the website for SOV Horror went down for maintenance at the tail end of 2023, and as of the time of recording, it hasn't come back. DBQ won't be for everyone. If you were hoping this would be a DIY horror flick, you're gonna be disappointed. This is a goofy sitcom-style picture till about 25 minutes in, and then the horror is short-lived and abrupt. But if you long for that specific taste of internet humour circa 2008-2009, this is very much an embodiment of that tone and era. I didn't love it outright, it's got its problems, but the nostalgia-driven fool in me had a soft spot for this kind of filmmaking. Not one I'd watch regularly, but I could absolutely see myself revisiting this film again in the future. Hot on the heels of DBQ, 2011's Death-O-Lantern was Warlock Home Video's second ever release, and had a frankly eye-watering production time. According to writer and director Chris Seaver, here using his recurring pseudonym of Rudy Belafonte, the film's pre-production lasted a little under a month, it was shot in a day and a half, and then edited and available to purchase within a week. In an interview for the Death-O-Lantern DVD release, Chris says that DBQ was a trial and error production and that a lot of lessons were learnt during the making of that film as to what worked and what didn't. Having now seen the film, I'd be inclined to agree, as, to me, it feels like a much stronger, but still somewhat imperfect, production across the board. The film's basically a horror comedy, but it's very dry self-referential comedy, pooling once again from that very particular style of internet humour that persisted between 2007 and around 2015. In the opening moments of the film, we're introduced to, and then say goodbye to, Greg, a small-town local who, while bending down to tie his shoes, winds up the victim of a mysterious pumpkin-masked killer, who dispatches Greg by shoving an entire candlestick through his head in a particularly gnarly but very impressive effect shot. The strange killer then disappears, his only calling card being a jack-o'-lantern left at the scene. It's here that we're introduced to Adrian and Phoebe. Phoebe is an avid horror fan and founding member of her college's horror club. Adrian's also a member and good friends with Phoebe, but she's a straight-A, clean-cut student. Phoebe, by contrast, is not, as illustrated by the opening scene where Adrian has to drag her away from an early morning screening of Night of the Creeps at her local Cineplex to go to college. When the pair arrive, they're met by two other members of the horror club, Patrick and Lucas, who are total hardcore film nerd dude bros guys, for real. They gleefully inform Adrian and Phoebe about Greg's murder. Adrian is distraught, but Phoebe is kinda nonplussed, saying people get murdered and die all the time. In fact, the most upset the gang seem to get is when Patrick comes to the realisation that Greg's death might cause the Cineplex's annual Halloween costume party to be cancelled. When Adrian continues to mourn the death of her friend, Greg was in the horror club, the gang call her a lamoid and go out bowling. While out bowling, they introduce us to Lamar. And I need to take a second here because there's kind of a multi-layer thing going on with Lamar as a character. So, the film's obviously parodying 80s slasher movies and leads with a strong self-awareness. It knows it's leaning into stereotypes and parody, and its humour is a mixture of dry and withering snipes and goofy over-the-topness. Lamar is supposed to be playing a stereotypical role of black guy in horror movie who gets killed early on because he's black. And in and of itself, that's not a big deal. A lot of films have played on the trope of black guys are the first to die when it comes to horror films. What is the problem is I am 99% confident that the actor playing Lamar isn't black. I'm about 50% sure they've just blacked up a white guy and stuck an afro wig on him. This thing's shot on video, so it's very murky and hard to make out because of the low resolution and poor lighting, but they pretty much have this guy just rattle out black guy stereotypes, particularly about the size of his penis, until both him and the lady he's trying to hit up at the bowling alley are killed. It was kind of problematic to me, and it pretty much poured cold water on the film in a way that it didn't really fully recover from. I guess what I'm saying is that if that kind of thing kills a buzz for you, and it kind of did for me, then you'll need to be prepared for that, because it really did bring the film down a bit in my opinion. Anyway, as mentioned, Lamar and the woman he's trying to bang get murdered, and news once again reaches the horror gang. On a whim, Patrick and Lucas somehow managed to steal the ongoing case file for all the murders up to now from a cop car, and Phoebe uses it as the basis to try and research exactly what's going on. After a long night of hitting the books, Phoebe thinks she's found the answer: a local folk legend of a town drunk by the name of Stingy Jack. Jack was an irritable git from the 1800s who eventually developed a taste for pranking local children, especially around Halloween time. However, one year his prank went too far and he accidentally killed a kid. Jack was sentenced to death, but just before he was set to be executed, he made a deal with the devil. Jack's life would be spared, but at a cost. That cost being that he would still have to be executed, but for 3 nights every year thereafter, the 29th until the 31st of October, he would be given the opportunity to have his mortal body restored. All he had to do was kill 6 children. Phoebe confirms that every year in the town, between 1 and 3 children have been murdered since, with a record being 5 kids. But each and every time the magic number's been missed and Jack's been cast back to hell to try again next year. Eventually, at some point in the 1950s, it seemed like Jack had given up, but now it's the 80s, and Jack's back to try again. The gang are uncertain of Phoebe's findings, but decide to go with it, as what other answer could there be? Phoebe suggests that they run a stakeout to try and catch whoever's doing this in the act, and points over to a girl sat in the cinema dressed in leather by the name of Scarlett. Scarlett's a nasty piece of work, a no-nonsense weapons specialist. She's a badass and she loves horror movies. The gang approach her to ask if she'd be willing to help them, but she basically tells them to fuck off because she's watching Big Trouble in Little China. That night, the gang are on the stakeout and it isn't going well. They found nothing, it's cold, and they want to go home. Phoebe suggests a last make-or-break attempt at pulling the killer out using Adrian as bait. The gang watch from a hiding space to see if it draws anyone out, and it works. A little too well. As Jack appears and then kills Adrian. Luckily, around the same time, Scarlett drops in after finally deciding that hanging around with the dweebs beats sitting around at home. She launches shurikens at Jack before getting the rest of the gang away to safety. At a local cafe, the gang recoup and take stock. They've resolved, however, to one thing: Jack's gonna pay. They realised fairly quickly that he's next likely to strike at the upcoming Halloween costume party at the Cineplex, and it's here that we enter our final act, as the gang suit up for a party to remember. Will Jack claim his final victims? Will Patrick and Lucas score? And will the movie manage to actually go for more than 5 minutes without name-dropping half a dozen studio pictures? Well, all this and more will be answered if you check out Death O' And on the whole, this film's absolutely a tighter production than the first offering from Warlock, but that doesn't mean it isn't without its pitfalls too. For starters, the script feels much more fleshed out, much more honed. The actual plot of the film matches the marketing pitch for starters, so that's a big win. I feel like having the film ground its foundations in actual real-world folklore, using it as a spring pad to launch the story, really does help keep this thing on the level. It's a mid-length production, clocking in at just over 44 minutes, but it has a pretty evenly paced 3-act structure. The transitions are a little clunky here and there, but it handles itself pretty reasonably. I feel like Chris as a writer, at least at this point in his career, could write strong openings, alright middles, and very wobbly endings. Because basically that's what happens here. The film has a really solid opening, especially given the turnaround times and the nature of SOV as a subgenre. It establishes its tone, the characters, the scenario, and doesn't handhold too heavily either for most of the first act. However, things do slow down quite a bit in the second act as we get bogged down in the stakeout and research stuff, to the point that the film basically stops for 5 minutes in the middle while Phoebe recounts the entire stingy Jack lore in a rather dry sequence. And then, the third act has its moments, it's fun in places, but the big end reveal of how the teens overcome Jack is super weak, and after that's revealed, the film just abruptly stops, dunking the audience back out of the film without so much as a buy nor leave. It's a bit of a backhanded compliment, but this film kind of reminded me of those ultra low budget early to mid 60s early gore films. The kind of stuff that Ray Dennis Steckler was getting stuck into, in the sense that it's a film that trades more on a literal written story than it does on the visuals. It's the kind of film where, totally on a whim, it just pulls the plug with little to no notice. I've sat through so many 60s films that have just stopped, and that's what this thing does. I found it a very cold way to end the film and a frustrating way to tie things off at that. To the film's credit, however, it does handle its tone a lot better than Barbecue. The first offering was semi-improvised and a little bit aimless at times. With this one, I'm not saying they don't improvise, but because of the clearer vision, it means the tone is able to be a little less scattershot. I got the feeling with DBQ that it didn't know if it wanted to be internet humour funny, trauma funny, or a more subversive type of picture. There's no mistaking that this film just wants to be a hyper self-aware parody of 80s slasher films, but not an overly bad one. It leans softly into so bad it's good style production values, but it never actively tries to dive to the bottom of the barrel. Which, I mean, I'm not really a fan of when a film actively starts production with the moniker "let's make trash," but if it must, the soft touch approach is always much more appreciated than, say, whatever the hell Troma's third-party filmmakers are churning out of the slurry tank these days. What was a bit of an issue for me was the dialogue. I loved how little of a shit the characters gave across the runtime on this one. It kind of reminded me a bit of the old Five Go Mad comic strip films, in the sense that these are oblivious characters in a heavily parodied world just kind of accepting the absurdity of their surroundings. I had a lot of time for that tone and vibe when it came up, and it did a lot in the dialogue, particularly in the scenes where Adrian mourns the death of her close friends, while all her other friends, who were also friends of the murder victims, are just like, "Get over yourself, dude, you're harshing our buzz." I thought that was kind of wonderful. What I didn't like so much was the constant, and I mean constant, references to other horror and science fiction movies. As a golden rule of filmmaking, I always advise people don't name drop bigger films in your film, and if you absolutely must, do it once, twice at most, tie it heavily into the plot and then move on. Because it basically just means that the viewer is almost immediately going to be thinking, consciously or subconsciously, oh hey, they referenced a movie. That was a much loved great movie. I hadn't thought of that movie in a while. Why am I watching this movie? I could be watching that movie. And this film name drops other films, quotes other films, and references other films in a scattergun approach that honestly makes it near enough impossible to get to the other side without immediately wanting to rev up The Thing, Nightmare on Elm Street, or the Return of the Living Dead films. Quite honestly, it's annoying. In some cases it makes the film feel like a lesser product because it essentially just turns into an advert for all these other movies. It was a bit too much for me in places, which was a real shame. On the direction front, we have a much cleaner end product. I feel like with Chris taking on sole ownership for direction and writing, there's much more consistency in the vision here, and it's pretty solid. I won't go as far as to say it's life-changing, but I have seen a lot worse in terms of SOV features. This thing has a clear style, a clear voice behind it. It's imperfect, but there's a lot of good to be found in this thing. And I for one quite enjoyed the more homemade style of the production. There wasn't much crew communication to speak of on set because, well, it was quite literally Chris, and if any of the other actors were free they might have helped out behind the scenes. So for a one-man army approach on next to no budget shot in 36 hours, I'd say it was actually quite well done. Direction of the cast is a little lackluster. Chris, I feel, has managed to really nail the deliveries, with them being just snarky and obnoxious enough to be enjoyable, not snarky and obnoxious enough to cross the line into full-blown irritating. I think he did a really solid job of guiding the cast through this distinct tone of humour. I will say though that outside of whoever it was playing Jack, the majority of the cast's physical presence on screen was a bit bland. We're once again into the realm of actor walks into shot, hits their mark, gets their lines out as quickly and cleanly as possible, and then they either stay perfectly still until the camera cuts, or they walk off their mark. There's very little prop work, very little work within the set space, and the fact that most of the film is shot indoors doesn't help matters either, as it makes for a drab and dry experience for a lot of the scenes. On the Cine front, it's a big step up from DBQ, and it showcases a journey yet to be travelled for Chris & Co. Shots are a bit of a mixed bag. Compositionally, they aren't the worst I've ever seen, but none of the shots are particularly well balanced. Expect plenty of wonky shots where the tripod wasn't levelled off properly, and randomly composed shots that are either too zoomed in or too zoomed out. But I'd say there was nothing hideous here. They actually utilised some lighting for a good chunk of this film, and while the lighting isn't particularly stylised and only used in a limited capacity, it does help pull up those indoor scenes a little, even if both the lights and the camera's tripod end up in the background of a lot of those scenes. Colour usage is an improvement over here. Blues, oranges, browns and reds seem to be the flavour of the day, and I think while it's not perfect, it at least helps give the film a sense of identity. It pulls it up above the more dreary and washed out offerings within the SOV subgenre. The editing is improved as well, cuts are much more considered, there's more of an emphasis on B-roll, the practical effects shots are really nicely handled. I was honestly mostly surprised by that. It's a big improvement, and again, while it's by no means good or excellent, it's a sign of improvement. And it was enough to really make me intrigued to check out Chris's other works based off its strengths. Performance-wise, everyone's using pseudonyms, so I'm going to talk generally. They're fine. The majority of the cast are animate, hammy, they really throw themselves into the role, they're over the top. To some, they may even be seen as irritating, but I personally actually quite liked these characters. I found them oddly endearing in a weird way. They pretty much kept me watching in even the most dire moments of this film, so while they lacked a certain degree of physicality, I'll give them a pass, they did okay. And finally, the soundtrack. It's more copyrighted music. I don't know how they got away with this. Did they license it? They couldn't have licensed it. The film had a grand total of a 1.5-month production cycle from initial planning to selling DVDs on a website. The cost alone for Somebody's Watching Me would have surely outstripped the entire film's production budget 100 times over. I don't know. It does kind of work, but it's weird hearing copyrighted tracks over DIY SOV horror films. It's like seeing a pig in a top hat. Unsettling. Death O' Lantern was released in 2011 after an ultra-quick turnaround by Warlock Home Video. I can confirm it definitely had a DVD release at the time. I believe there may have even been a limited edition VHS release too. In 2020, the film would get redistributed by SOV Horror alongside a raft of extras, including an interview with Chris Seaver, an on-set archive interview piece with the cast, trailers for upcoming SOV Horror releases, a YouTube review of the film by a quote superfan, and much more. The pitch quality is quite a bit better than DBQ's release, less pixelation and more vibrant colours are on hand, the sound quality has a bit of a boost too. It's probably the best this film's ever looked, and if you are curious to check this one out, that would likely be the version I'd recommend. Oh, and as an aside, because I couldn't really fit it in anywhere else, this film actually got a ground-up remake in 2016 in 4K. It's called Death O' Lantern The Remake, and it's quite literally that, a HD remake 5 years after the original stab at it to try and polish the film up, learn from the experience of the past half-decade and take some time to really make the film shine. I really kind of want to check that one out, but it seems to be out of print, so if anyone can hook me up with a copy, do let me know. When I first watched Death O' Lantern, I was conflicted. I found it to be a mixed bag of a production and I wasn't 100% sure how I felt about it. But on a rewatch, I actually kind of enjoyed it a bit more than last time. I could absolutely see people being super irritated by the tone and humour of this thing, and the stuff with Lamar has not aged well, but this thing had heart for the most part. It felt like a genuine attempt at making something fun. And when that's the case, it makes me feel like it wasn't a waste of the audience's time to check it out. With that being said, I don't think it would be an immediate go-to watch for me, but I'd happily recommend it as one to check out, especially with Halloween right around the corner. If you've gone through all the usual haunts and are looking for something a little more homemade, give this one a spin.